In 1848, on the fever-soaked banks of the Louisiana bayou, a plantation owner sealed his family's fate with a purchase he believed was a bargain. The air in the New Orleans slave market that day was a thick soup of sweat, cheap perfume, and despair, a stench so familiar it had become the city's true scent. Elias Thorne, master of the Vaudreuil sugar plantation, stood apart from the rabble. He was a man carved from pride and profit, his family name a dynasty built on cane fields and human bondage. He wasn't there for field hands. He was there for a specific skill. His wife, Isabel, was with child again, her fourth pregnancy in 5 years, each one more fragile than the last. The parish doctor was a drunkard, and the old slave woman who served as midwife was losing her sight. Elias needed competence. He needed control. That's when he saw her. She was listed only as Amara, from a recently liquidated estate on the Sea Islands of Georgia. The auctioneer spoke of her in hushed tones, mentioning her skill with difficult births, her knowledge of roots and herbs. But there was a tremor in his voice, a hesitation that made the other planters, men who could smell risk like a hound smells blood, turn their attention elsewhere. Her price started low, insultingly so for a woman with such a reputation. Yet no hands were raised. The silence in the courtyard grew heavy, unnatural. The other bidders studied their boots, the sky, anything but the woman on the block. Elias Thorne, however, saw only an opportunity. He saw a tool, an asset being foolishly overlooked. He raised his paddle, his bit a sharp crack in the suffocating quiet. He paid less for her than he would for a healthy mule. He believed he had cheated the world. In reality, he had just invited the world's oldest, darkest judgment into his home, and it had answered the door wearing his wife's face. The journey back to Vaudreuil was a silent one. Amara sat in the back of the wagon, her hands bound not with rope, but with an unnerving stillness. She didn't weep or plead. She simply watched. Her gaze swept over the cypress trees dripping with Spanish moss, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching from a watery grave. She observed the slow, menacing crawl of the bayou's black water. It was not the gaze of a captive, but of a queen assessing a newly conquered territory. When they arrived at the grand white-columned facade of the Vaudreuil plantation, the other slaves fell silent. They watched her dismount, and a ripple of something ancient and fearful passed through them. It was a recognition that went deeper than words, a shared memory carried in the blood from a continent away. Elias's overseer, a brutal man named Leclerc, moved to take her arm, but he stopped short. Her eyes met his, and for a moment the man who used a whip as an extension of his own voice seemed to forget how to speak. Elias, blind to these undercurrents, was pleased. He saw fear, and to him fear meant control. He ordered Amara to be housed in a small, isolated cabin near the main house, a place reserved for trusted servants. He wanted her close, a tool ready at hand for when his wife's time came. That night, Elias stood on his veranda, a glass of brandy in his hand, looking out over the fields that made him a king. He felt the familiar surge of power, of ownership. He owned the land, the cane, the people. He owned the woman in the cabin. He believed, with the unshakable arrogance of his class, that he could own knowledge itself. But some knowledge cannot be owned. It can only be served. And Amara served a power far older and far more patient than any plantation master. She was not a slave. She was a priestess in a temple of her own making, and Elias had just delivered her to the altar. A week after Amara's arrival, the first sign appeared, so subtle it was almost missed. Leclerc, the overseer, kept a pair of prized hunting dogs, vicious animals he used to track runaways. He loved them more than any human. One morning he found the younger of the two lying dead by the kennels. There were no marks on its body, no foam at its mouth. It was simply empty. The parish veterinarian, a man more accustomed to treating livestock, declared it a heart seizure, a freak occurrence. But the other slaves knew better. They whispered amongst themselves in the cane fields, the words carried on the humid breeze. They spoke of the evil eye, of juju and roots. They said the dog had barked incessantly at Amara's cabin the night before, and she had simply stared at it from her doorway until it fell silent. Elias dismissed it as superstitious nonsense. A dog had died. It was a loss of property, nothing more. He was a man of logic, of profit and loss. He could not, would not, entertain the primitive fears of his slaves. But he did notice a change. Leclerc was unnerved. The man's cruelty had always been fueled by a kind of blustering confidence. Now there was a crack in that facade. He avoided Amara's cabin, his gaze skittering away whenever she was near. The fear she inspired was a more effective leash than any Elias could provide. This suited Elias perfectly. He had bought a midwife, and it seemed he had gotten a new overseer management tool for free. Isabel, his wife, was now 7 months pregnant, and her health was failing. She was plagued by fevers and a deep, unshakable melancholy. The doctor's tonics did nothing. Elias, growing desperate, finally summoned Amara to the main house. It was time for his new acquisition to prove her worth. He was about to learn that Amara's worth was measured not in dollars, but in souls. The belief in a supernatural source of evil is not necessary. Men alone are quite capable of every wickedness. Joseph Conrad Amara entered the grand manor of Vaudreuil, not as a slave, but as a physician entering a patient's room. She moved with a silent, unnerving grace, her bare feet making no sound on the polished cypress floors. The air in Isabel's bedroom was heavy with the scent of lavender and sickness. Isabel Thorne lay pale against the silk pillows, a fragile porcelain doll on the verge of shattering. Her blue eyes, usually bright with a nervous energy, were clouded with a deep-seated fear. The parish doctor, smelling faintly of whiskey, stood by the window, his impotence hanging around him like a shroud. Elias watched, impatient. "Well, what is it?" "What's wrong with her?" Amara did not answer him. She ignored the 2 white men in the room completely. She moved to the bedside and gently took Isabel's hand. Her touch was not that of a servant, but of an equal. She looked into Isabel's eyes, a long, searching gaze that seemed to peel back layers of skin and bone, and peered directly into the soul. "The baby is afraid," Amara said, her voice a low, melodic hum. "It feels the mother's fear, and it weakens." The doctor scoffed. "Nonsense. It's a uterine fever. She needs another bleeding." Amara turned her head slowly, her gaze fixing on the doctor with such intensity that he physically flinched. "You bleed her again, and you will bury them both," she said. It was not a warning. It was a statement of fact. She then turned to Elias. "Your house is filled with shadows. Your wife breathes them in. Send him away," she said, nodding at the doctor. "His medicine is poison. Give me 3 days. I will brew teas from the swamp. I will burn cleansing herbs. I will sit with her. The fever will break and the shadows will flee." Elias was trapped. To trust a slave over a white, educated doctor was unthinkable. But to watch his wife and unborn heir perish was a fate far worse. He looked at Isabel, who was now clinging to Amara's hand as if it were a lifeline. In that moment, the master of Vaudreuil lost control of his own house. "Do it," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. For 3 days and 3 nights, Amara did not leave Isabel's side. The bedroom, once a bastion of white southern femininity, was transformed. The cloying scent of lavender was replaced by the sharp, earthy smells of burning sage and boiling roots. Amara barred the doctor from entry and allowed only one trusted house servant to bring water and linens. Elias found himself pacing the halls of his own home like a caged animal, an intruder in his own life. He could hear Amara's voice from behind the closed door, not speaking, but humming, a low, continuous, hypnotic chant that seemed to vibrate in the very walls of the house. On the second night, a fierce storm rolled in from the Gulf, lashing the plantation with wind and rain. Thunder rattled the windows, and through the din, Elias heard his wife cry out. He rushed to the door, but it was barred from the inside. He pounded on it, shouting Isabel's name. The door opened a crack. Amara stood there, her silhouette framed by the dim candlelight within. "The fever is breaking," she said, her voice calm amidst the raging storm. "It is a difficult birth. The spirit must fight to be born just as the body does. Go back to your brandy. This is the work of women, not of masters." The dismissal was so absolute, so audacious, that Elias was left speechless. He was the master, yet he was being told to stand aside. He retreated, his authority crumbling, his fear mingling with a strange, unwilling respect. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm had passed. The sun rose over a world washed clean. The door to Isabel's room opened. Amara emerged, her face weary but serene. "You may see them now," she said. Elias rushed inside. The air was clean and fresh. Isabel was asleep. Her color returned, her breathing deep and even. And in a bassinet beside the bed lay his son, small and perfect, wrapped in clean linen. He had a healthy air. Amara had delivered, But as he looked at the woman standing silently in the corner, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He hadn't just purchased a midwife. He had entered into a transaction far more complex, and he had a terrifying premonition that the final payment had not yet been made. The birth of his son. Thomas should have solidified Elias Thorne's dynasty. Instead, it marked the beginning of its erosion. Isabel became utterly dependent on Amara. She would not eat a meal unless Amara had inspected it, would not sleep unless Amara had prepared a calming tea. She spoke of Amara not as a slave, but as a guardian, a confidant. "She understands things, Elias," Isabel would whisper, her eyes wide. "She sees the world behind the world." Amara, for her part, assumed a new role in the household. She was no longer just the midwife. She was the shadow matriarch. Her influence was quiet but absolute. The other house servants treated her with a mixture of profound reverence and abject terror. They obeyed her commands instantly, often before she even spoke them, seeming to anticipate her needs. Leclerc, the overseer, had been completely neutered. After the death of his second prized dog, found drowned in a shallow water trough, an impossible accident, he had descended into a permanent state of drunken paranoia. He rarely left his office, and his duties were increasingly neglected. The plantation, once a machine of brutal efficiency, began to drift. Elias saw it, felt it, but was powerless to stop it. How could he reassert control? If he punished Amara, he risked his wife's sanity, and he now believed his son's health. He had made Amara indispensable, and in doing so, he had forged his own chains. One evening, Elias walked past the slave quarters and saw a sight that froze his blood. A small circle of the slave women were gathered around Amara. She was not speaking, but drawing symbols in the dirt with a stick. As they watched, their faces were transformed, their expressions a mixture of awe and fierce concentration. It was a classroom, a sermon, a war council. She was not just healing their bodies. She was awakening their minds, teaching them a history and a power that slavery had tried to beat out of them. He was not just losing control of his house. He was losing control of his entire world. You're not supposed to know this, but in the slave-holding South, there was a whispered history of what they called night doctors. These were not physicians, but figures of terror, both real and imagined. Rumors spread of men who would steal slaves in the dead of night for gruesome medical experiments. But there was another deeper fear among the masters, a fear not of white doctors, but of their own slaves' knowledge. They feared the root doctor, the conjure woman, the one who knew the secrets of the earth. They knew that the same hand that could brew a tea to cure a fever could also pick a leaf that could stop a heart, a poison that left no trace. This was the terror that began to fester in Elias Thorne's mind. He started watching Amara, studying her as she tended her herb garden, a plot of land she had claimed behind her cabin, which now flourished with plants he had never seen before. She would spend hours there, her hands in the dirt, her lips moving in a silent conversation with the leaves. She labeled nothing. The knowledge was not in a book. It was inside her. He began to see her influence everywhere. A field hand who had been whipped by Leclerc for insolence fell ill with a mysterious stomach ailment. Amara treated him and he recovered, but not before Leclerc's replacement horse threw a shoe and went lame. Coincidence? A house servant who was caught stealing silver was dismissed and sold downriver. A week later, the new owner sent word that the woman had died of a sudden, violent fever. Bad luck? Elias started questioning the other slaves, trying to pry information from them. But he was met with a wall of silence. Their eyes would go blank, their faces would become unreadable masks. They would profess ignorance, claiming only that Amara was a good healer, a blessing from God. But the way they said God felt different. It didn't sound like the Christian God he preached about on Sundays. It sounded like something older, darker, and far more demanding of sacrifice. He realized they weren't protecting her from him. They were protecting him from her. The second death came in the suffocating heat of August. It was not a dog this time, but a man. His name was Bo, a new field hand Elias had acquired, a man known for his brute strength and his equally brutal temper. He had a reputation for forcing himself on the women in the quarters, a practice Elias tolerated as long as it didn't disrupt the work. One afternoon, several women ran to the main house, their voices shrill with panic. Bo was dead. They had found him at the edge of the cane fields, his body contorted, his face a mask of agony. The parish doctor was summoned again. He examined the body, sweat beading on his brow, and declared the cause of death to be a snakebite. He pointed to 2 small puncture marks on the man's ankle. Case closed. But later that day, as Elias was reviewing the account books, one of the older slave men, a quiet carpenter named Samuel, came to his study. This was unheard of. Samuel stood twisting his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Master Thorne," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That wasn't no snake." "What are you talking about, Samuel?" The doctor saw the marks. Samuel finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a terror so profound it made Elias's skin crawl. "A snake kills from the outside in, master." "Whatever got Bo? It killed him from the inside out. I seen it before, a long time ago. A man who did wrong to the womenfolk. They found him just like Bo, his insides. They was all burned up." Samuel swallowed hard. "And there's something else. Them 2 marks on his ankle, they was put there after he was already dead. Put there to fool you." Before Elias could ask another question, Samuel bowed his head and backed out of the room, leaving Elias alone with a truth that was beginning to take shape in the shadows of his mind. Amara had not struck Bo. She didn't need to. She had simply taught the women how to defend themselves. She had armed them with knowledge, a weapon far more potent than any knife or gun. And the first casualty of this silent, unseen war lay cooling in a wooden box, his death officially blamed on a serpent. In a way, the doctor was right. Can you imagine that? To live in a house where the walls themselves seem to be listening, where the very air you breathe feels charged with a power you can't see or understand. This became Elias Thorne's reality. He started to feel like a foreigner in his own kingdom. The rhythms of the plantation, once so familiar, now seemed alien. The songs the slaves sang in the fields had changed. The melodies were more somber, the harmonies more complex, carrying a weight of meaning that eluded him. The symbols Amara drew in the dirt began appearing elsewhere, small, almost invisible marks scratched onto the door of the smokehouse or the handle of a hoe. They were a language he could not read, a declaration of an authority he could not challenge. His wife, Isabel, had recovered her physical health, but her mind seemed to have drifted somewhere he couldn't reach. She would spend hours sitting with Amara, not talking but weaving baskets from river cane, her fingers moving in perfect, mirrored synchronicity with the older woman's. Isabel had once been a creature of society, obsessed with gossip from New Orleans and the latest fashions from Paris. Now her world had shrunk to the size of Amara's cabin. Elias felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. He was surrounded by his family, his servants, his empire, yet he was completely isolated. He was the master, the patriarch, the man with the legal power of life and death, but he was losing the war for the souls of his own household. He tried to reassert his dominance in the only way he knew how, through brutality. He ordered a field hand whipped for a minor infraction, a punishment he hadn't used in months. He made Leclerc oversee it, forcing the drunken overseer to perform his old duties. The man went through the motions, his hands shaking, his eyes darting towards Amara's cabin. Amara herself watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. She did not intervene. She simply observed. The next morning, Elias awoke to find a single, perfect white feather lying on the pillow beside his head. The doors had been locked. The windows barred. There was no explanation for how it got there. It was a message. I can reach you anywhere. I can touch you while you sleep. You are safe only as long as I allow you to be. If you've come this far on this journey with me, do me a favor. Go down to the comments and type, "The roots run deep." It lets me know you're not just watching, you're understanding. You're seeing the patterns. Elias Thorne was beginning to see them too, and it was driving him to the brink of madness. He became obsessed with Amara's past. He sent letters to contacts in Georgia, trying to learn about the estate she came from, the one that had been liquidated. The replies that came back were sparse and laced with fear. The plantation had been owned by a family named Fairchild. They had been prosperous, powerful, and then, over the course of a single year, they had been wiped out. The patriarch, Jacob Fairchild, had died of a wasting sickness. His 2 sons had followed, one in a riding accident, the other from a sudden violent fever. His wife Elspeth had drowned herself in the river. The estate was considered cursed. The land was sold for a pittance, the slaves scattered to the 4 winds. The letters spoke of a powerful conjure woman on the Fairchild estate, a midwife who had lost her own daughter due to Jacob Fairchild's negligence. a woman who, they said, had sworn an oath that the Fairchild line would end with her daughter's generation. A woman named Amara. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. Amara wasn't just a murderer. She was a methodical, patient exterminator. She wasn't driven by impulsive rage, but by a cold, cosmic sense of justice. She was balancing the scales, one soul at a time. And Elias had brought this angel of vengeance into his own home, to the very heart of his family. He looked at his son, Thomas, sleeping in his crib, the living embodiment of his legacy, his dynasty. And for the first time, he saw not a beginning, but an end. He saw a debt waiting to be collected. He finally understood. Amara hadn't been sold to him by chance. She had been a seed of destruction planted in his family line, waiting for the right moment to sprout. Elias decided to act. He would not end up like Jacob Fairchild. He would excise this cancer before it could spread further. His plan was simple and brutal. He would sell her. He would send her so far downriver, to the harshest sugar plantations of the German coast, that her name would be forgotten, her influence erased. He sent word to a notorious slave trader in New Orleans, a man known for his lack of questions and his efficient cruelty. The trader agreed to come to Vaudreuil in 2 days' time. For those 2 days, Elias felt a semblance of his old self returning. He was taking control, imposing his will. He avoided speaking to Amara, avoided even looking at her. He spent his time in his study, drinking heavily, counting the hours until she would be gone. The night before the trader was due to arrive, Elias was woken from a drunken sleep by a sound. It was his wife Isabel weeping in the next room. He went to her, his mind clouded with alcohol and anger. "What is it, woman? Why are you crying?" Isabel looked at him, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask in the moonlight. "She told me," Isabel whispered. "Amara, she came to me in a dream. She told me you were sending her away." Elias's blood ran cold. "That's ridiculous. It's just a dream." "No," Isabel insisted, grabbing his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She said if she leaves, she will take Thomas with her." Elias stared at her, horrified. "What are you talking about? Take him where?" "To the world behind the world," Isabel sobbed. She said his soul is tied to hers now. She tethered it to him the day he was born to keep him safe. "If you break the cord, he will wither and die." "Elias, you can't do this! You'll kill our son." It was madness, psychological warfare. She had poisoned his wife's mind, planted this terrifying idea deep within her. But as he looked at Isabel's genuine, soul-shattering terror, he knew it didn't matter if it was real or not. For Isabel, it was real. And if he sent Amara away, his wife would lose her mind completely, and he had no doubt she would blame him for any harm that befell their son, real or imagined. Amara had checkmated him. She had turned his own wife and heir into her hostages. He could not sell her. He could not harm her. He could do nothing. The next morning, he sent a messenger to the slave trader with a note of cancellation and a handful of silver for his troubles. The cage door had been open for a moment, and Amara had slammed it shut, leaving Elias trapped inside with her. A historical footnote, whispered in the corridors of academia but rarely printed in books. The Gullah Geechee people of the Sea Islands, where Amara was from, maintained one of the most intact African cultural traditions in the United States. Their knowledge of herbalism, their spiritual beliefs, their understanding of the interconnectedness of the physical and spiritual worlds, it was a direct inheritance from West Africa. They believed that the veil between worlds was thin and that those with the knowledge, the ashe, could move between them. They understood that a poison for the body was less potent than a poison for the mind. This was the tradition that now held Vaudreuil in its grip. After Elias's failed attempt to sell her, Amara's power became overt. She no longer hid her teachings. She established what was, in effect, a new religion on the plantation. It was a syncretic faith. Blending the Christian parables the slaves were forced to learn with the older, deeper magic she had brought with her. She spoke of a God who did not turn the other cheek, but who demanded balance. She taught that suffering was a debt, and that all debts must one day be paid. The white church Elias had built on his property, where a terrified preacher spouted platitudes every Sunday, stood empty. The true sermons were being held in the deep of night, in the cypress swamp, under the light of a full moon. Elias knew this was happening. He even followed them one night, hiding in the shadows, watching as they danced and chanted around a bonfire. He saw Amara anoint the foreheads of the women with a mixture of ash and river water. He saw expressions on their faces he had never seen before. Not fear, not despair, but a kind of fierce, ecstatic freedom. He was witnessing the birth of an army, a spiritual army armed not with guns but with belief. And he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that they were preparing for a war. He just didn't know who the next target would be. Elias Thorne began to wither. It was not a physical sickness, but a decay of the spirit. He felt like a ghost haunting the halls of his own life. His authority was a joke. The plantation ran itself according to Amara's will. His wife was a stranger to him, a devotee in a cult of which he was the designated devil. His son, Thomas, was a healthy, thriving child, but Elias could barely bring himself to look at him. Every time he did, he heard Isabel's terrified words. His soul is tied to hers. The boy seemed to prefer Amara to anyone, even his own mother. He would toddle after her, his small hand clutching her dress, his laughter echoing in her presence. It was a perversely perfect family portrait, with him on the outside looking in. He spent most of his days in his study, the shutters drawn, a bottle of bourbon his only companion. He neglected the plantation's finances, ignored correspondence. He was a king who had abdicated his throne but was still forced to live in the castle, a prisoner of his own legacy. It was during this period that Isabel announced she was pregnant again. The news, which should have been a cause for celebration, filled Elias with a cold, paralyzing dread. Another child, another soul for Amara to potentially tether, to hold hostage. This time he resolved things would be different. He would send Isabel to her sister in New Orleans to have the baby, away from Amara's influence. He would use the best doctors the city had to offer. He would break the cycle. He presented the idea to Isabel as a chance for a change of scenery, a respite from the oppressive summer heat. But she saw through the ruse immediately. Her reaction was not just refusal. It was sheer terror. "No!" she shrieked, her eyes wide with panic. "I can't!" "Amara must deliver the baby. Only she knows how." "The doctors will kill it! They'll kill me!" She collapsed into a fit of hysterics, and Amara had to be summoned to calm her with one of her teas. As Amara led his weeping wife back to her room, she paused and looked at Elias over her shoulder. Her expression was not one of triumph. It was one of pity. It was the look a predator gives to a creature caught in a trap, a silent acknowledgement that the struggle is over. Honestly, what would you do? When every path is blocked, every choice a different kind of damnation? Elias was a man of action, a man who solved problems with money, power, and violence. But those tools were useless here. Violence against Amara was unthinkable. The repercussions from the other slaves, and from his own wife, would be catastrophic. He couldn't buy his way out of this. His power was an illusion. He was trapped in a psychological prison, and Amara was the warden, the judge, and the jury. The months of Isabel's second pregnancy passed in a fog of dread. She was healthier this time, under Amara's constant care, but her mind seemed to slip further away. She spoke constantly of the spirit world, of the ancestors who watched over the baby. She claimed Amara was a conduit, a bridge between worlds. To Elias, it sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. He felt a growing resentment towards his wife. She had chosen this. She had willingly submitted to Amara's influence, had sacrificed their family, their legacy, on the altar of her own fear. He began to sleep in a guest room, the distance between their beds a chasm that could no longer be crossed. One night, unable to sleep, he walked the grounds of the plantation. The moon was full, bathing the cane fields in a ghostly silver light. He found himself standing outside Amara's cabin. There was a faint light inside. He crept closer, peering through a crack in the shutters. What he saw was not some dark ritual. It was Amara, sitting in a rocking chair, with his son Thomas asleep in her lap. She was humming the same low, hypnotic tune she had hummed while Isabel was in labor. The scene was one of perfect maternal tranquility, and that's what terrified him the most. It wasn't an act. The love and care she showed the boy were genuine. She wasn't just a monster. She was something far more complex, far more dangerous. She was a creator and a destroyer, a healer and a killer. She was a mother who had lost her own child, and now she was claiming his. He stumbled back into the darkness, the bourbon in his gut turning to ice. He finally understood the true nature of his defeat. She wasn't going to destroy his family. She was going to replace him. The day of Isabel's labor arrived. It was was a sweltering day in July, the air so thick it felt like breathing water. This time, Elias did not even try to enter the room. He sat in his study, the door open, listening to the muffled sounds from upstairs. He heard Isabel cry out, but it was not a cry of pain. It was one of effort. He heard Amara's calm, steady voice murmuring instructions. He heard the other women who were assisting her, their voices a low, supportive chorus. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath. An hour passed, then two. Finally, silence. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He waited for the cry of a newborn, the sound that would signal another link in the chain of his dynasty. But the cry never came. After an eternity, Amara appeared in the doorway of his study. Her face was a placid mask, but her eyes held a deep, ancient sorrow. "It was a girl," she said, her voice soft. "But her spirit was not strong enough for this world. She is with the ancestors now." Numbness washed over Elias. A stillbirth, a tragedy, but a natural one. These things happened. The doctor had warned him of the risks with Isabel's fragile health. But then Amara said something else. "Sometimes," she said, her gaze unwavering, "a garden is too crowded. A branch must be pruned to allow the main stalk to grow strong. The Vaudreuil line needs one strong root, not many weak ones. Thomas will be strong. I will see to it." She was not offering condolences. She was delivering a verdict. She was explaining her work. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a decision. She had pruned his family tree. She had ensured that no more of his children would be born. The promise of the video's title wasn't about a single act. It was a declaration of ongoing war against his legacy. He had bought a midwife to ensure the continuation of his line, and in the stroke of cosmic irony, she had become its appointed executioner. He finally understood why she had spared his son. A legacy needs an heir. By keeping Thomas alive, she kept Elias's hope alive. And hope was the cruelest torture of all. The official cause of death for the infant was failure to thrive. The parish doctor signed the certificate without a second glance. Elias buried his daughter in the family plot behind the main house, under a small, unmarked stone. Isabel did not attend the burial. She remained in her room, serene and unnervingly calm. When Elias tried to speak to her about their loss, she simply smiled a beatific, empty smile. "She was not meant for us," Isabel said, her voice distant. Amara explained it. She was a spirit who only needed to touch this world for a moment before returning home. "We should be happy for her." The woman he had married was gone, replaced by this hollow-eyed convert. Amara had not just taken his daughter. She had taken his wife's grief, robbing him even of the ability to mourn with her. Life at Vaudreuil settled into a new, terrifying normal. The plantation was now, for all intents and purposes, a matriarchy run by Amara. Elias was a figurehead, a ghost rattling around in his own mansion. His days were a monotonous cycle of bourbon and despair. He took no interest in the plantation, in his son, in anything. He was a man waiting for the end. A year later, Isabel was pregnant again. The news felt like a death sentence. Elias begged her, pleaded with her to go to New Orleans. He offered her anything. She simply refused, her eyes reflecting the calm, unshakable faith of a true believer. "Amara will protect us," she would say, and the conversation would be over. He knew, with the weary certainty of a condemned man, how this would end. He began to mark the days on a calendar in his study, counting down not to a birth, but to a death. It was a bizarre, self-imposed torture. He watched his wife's belly grow, a vessel carrying another doomed soul, another sacrifice to Amara's inscrutable god of balance. He started having nightmares, not of monsters or demons, but of a garden. He was standing in a vast, overgrown garden, and Amara was there with a pair of pruning shears, methodically cutting down every stalk, every flower that bore his family's crest, leaving only one. There's a concept in some West African spiritual traditions, particularly those that evolved into voodoo and hoodoo, of the crossroads. It's a place of immense power, where the spirit world and the physical world meet. To stand at the crossroads is to make a choice that will define your destiny. Elias Thorne was standing at a crossroads of his own making, and every road led to ruin. He could try to kill Amara. He had thought about it, fantasized about it in his drunken stupors. A hunting accident, a fire in her cabin, but he knew he could never succeed. She was protected, not by magic, but by the fierce loyalty of every other slave on the plantation. They would tear him apart with their bare hands. He would die. His son would likely be killed in the chaos, and Amara's power would only be cemented. He could run. He could take Thomas and flee in the night, abandoning the plantation, his wife, everything. But where would he go? Amara's influence felt boundless. He had the distinct feeling that her network, the one she was building among the women of the parish, would find him. He imagined receiving a note, a feather, a sign, hundreds of miles away, letting him know he was still being watched. And even if he escaped, he would be a ruined man, a coward who had abandoned his wife and his ancestral home. The third option was the one he had already chosen: to do nothing, to surrender, to sit in his study and watch his world unravel, one thread at a time. It was the choice of a dead man. During this time, his son Thomas began to talk, and the first word he spoke was not mama or papa, it was Amma. Elias heard it one afternoon as he passed the herb garden. Thomas was sitting in the dirt, playing with a wooden doll Amara had carved for him, and he looked up at her and said it, clear as a bell. Amma. Amara smiled and picked him up, holding him close. Elias felt something inside him shatter. It was the last, final piece of his pride. He turned and walked back to the house, went to his study, and for the first time did not reach for the bourbon. He reached for his pistol. He didn't check if it was loaded. He just sat with it in his lap, feeling the cold, heavy weight of it, the only thing in his world that still felt real. The second stillbirth occurred almost exactly a year after the first. Another girl. The circumstances were identical. A calm, efficient labor overseen by Amara. A baby born silent. An explanation delivered in a soft, pitying voice about a spirit too fragile for this world. This time Elias did not even pretend to believe it. He knew it was murder. A quiet, subtle medical murder that left no evidence, no witnesses willing to speak, no crime that could ever be proven. When Amara came to his study to deliver the news, he did not look at her. He stared at the wall, the unloaded pistol still on his desk. "Get out," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "Your wife needs you," Amara said gently. "She is asking for you. And I am telling you to get out of my house." "This is not your house anymore, Elias," she replied, and for the first time she used his given name. The sound of it on her lips was a violation, a final assertion of her dominance. "This is my house. I am the one who keeps it safe. I am the one who keeps the shadows at bay. You are just a guest here, a sad, drunken guest who has overstayed his welcome. But you will not be asked to leave. You are needed. Thomas needs a father, even a broken one, and the world needs a master of Vaudreuil. The title is yours. The power is mine. That is the arrangement. Do you understand?" He said nothing. He just sat there listening to the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. He heard her turn and walk away, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. The arrangement. It was a business deal. His life, his son's life, and the hollow shell of his former status in exchange for his complete and utter subjugation. He had bought a slave for a handful of silver, and she had, in turn, bought his soul. He picked up the pistol, walked to the window, and threw it into the bayou. Violence was no longer an option. There was no escape. There was only the arrangement. You're not just watching a story about the past. You're participating in an uncovering of a hidden truth, a truth about power. We are taught that power comes from wealth, from laws, from armies. But that's a lie. True power, the kind that lasts, comes from knowledge. The knowledge of the human heart, the human body, and the human soul. And it comes from the willingness to use that knowledge without mercy. After the second stillbirth, a strange peace settled over Vaudreuil. It was the peace of a battlefield after the final shot has been fired, the peace of absolute surrender. Elias Thorne was a broken man. He became a recluse, rarely venturing out of his study. He managed the plantation's accounts on autopilot, signing whatever papers were put in front of him by the new overseer, a quiet, efficient man named Samuel, the same carpenter who had warned him about Beau's death. Samuel, Elias knew, answered to Amara. The plantation was more profitable than ever. The slaves worked hard, not out of fear of the whip, but out of a shared sense of purpose. Vaudreuil had become something other than a plantation. It was a community, a sanctuary, a fortress, and Amara was its queen. Her reputation had spread throughout the parish. Planters who had once scorned her now sent messengers, begging for her help with sick livestock or ailing family members. She would sometimes agree for a price. Not money. She would demand a debt, a favor to be named later. She was building a web of influence that extended far beyond the borders of Vaudreuil. She was becoming a power in the region, a shadow broker who operated outside the white world of politics and commerce. but who could influence it in subtle, profound ways. Elias watched all of this from his window, a spectator in his own tragedy. He was no longer a participant. He was a historical artifact, a relic of a power structure that had already been overthrown. The revolution had happened, and it had been so quiet, so bloodless, that no one but him even knew it had occurred. Isabel announced her 5th pregnancy. By now the ritual was horribly familiar. Elias felt nothing. No hope, no fear, just a dull, aching emptiness. He knew the outcome. Amara had made her intentions clear. One strong root. Thomas would be his only heir. This pregnancy, however, was different. Isabel was weak, her body exhausted by the successive births. She was confined to her bed for the final months, and Amara's vigilance was constant. One afternoon, Elias found the courage to confront Amara. He found her in the herb garden, grinding leaves in a mortar. "This one too?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Amara did not look up from her work. "The body is a vessel," she said. "Sometimes the vessel cracks. It cannot hold another spirit." "You're killing her," Elias said, the accusation hanging dead in the humid air. "You're slowly killing my wife." Amara finally stopped grinding and looked at him. Her eyes were not cold or hateful. They were filled with a profound, almost maternal sadness. "I am not killing her, Elias. You did that. You did it with every child you demanded of her, every heir you needed to secure your name. You saw her as a vessel for your legacy, and you used her until she was empty. I am just managing the consequences of your ambition. I am giving her peace in a way you never could." Her words were a surgeon's scalpel, cutting through his denial, exposing the rotten truth at the core of his life. He had seen Isabel as a means to an end. He had prized her for her fertility, for her ability to produce sons. He had never truly seen her. And now it was too late. He turned away, unable to bear the weight of her gaze, the truth of her words. He had spent years seeing her as the monster, the demon who had destroyed his life. But what if she was just the mirror? The one who showed him the monster he had been all along? It was the most terrifying thought he had ever had. The end came not with a storm, but with a whisper. Isabel went into labor on a calm, cool night in October. The birth was short. The baby, a boy this time, was born silent, as expected. But this time Isabel did not recover. She began to bleed, a slow, unstoppable hemorrhage that no amount of Amara's herbs could stanch. Amara worked through the night, her face grim, her movements efficient, but Elias knew it was a performance. This was the final act. This was the balancing of the scales. Just before dawn, Amara came to him. "She is asking for you," she said. "She wants to say goodbye." He went to the bedroom. It was quiet, the air thick with the smell of blood and herbs. Isabel lay on the bed, her skin as white as the sheets. Her eyes were clear, the fog of Amara's influence seemingly lifted. She looked at him, and for the first time in years, he saw the woman he had married. "Elias," she whispered, her voice a faint rustle of leaves. "I'm sorry." "Don't talk," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Save your strength." She smiled, a weak, sad smile. "It's all right. I'm not afraid. Amara will look after Thomas." She squeezed his hand. "Promise me. Promise me you will let her." He looked past his dying wife, to the woman standing in the shadows by the window. Amara's face was unreadable. This was her masterpiece. She had not only ensured no more of his children would be born, she had taken the mother too. She had orchestrated it so that in her final moments, his wife's last wish was to entrust their only surviving child to her killer. It was a stroke of psychological cruelty so profound, so complete, that it bordered on art. "I promise," Elias heard himself say. And with that, Isabel closed her eyes and was gone. The Vaudreuil dynasty was officially extinct. It consisted now of a broken man and a young boy, both of them the property of a woman who had once been bought for the price of a mule. There is no finer revenge than that which others inflict on your enemy. A whispered Creole proverb. The funeral was a quiet affair. Elias stood by the grave as they lowered his wife's coffin into the earth next to the unmarked stones of her 3 dead children. His son Thomas stood beside him, his small hand holding not his father's, but Amara's. In the eyes of the world, Elias Thorne was a tragic figure, a man who had lost his wife and 3 children to the cruel whims of fate. He received letters of condolence from his peers, men who spoke of God's mysterious ways. They had no idea that God had nothing to do with it. This was the work of a different power entirely. After the funeral, the transformation of Vaudreuil was complete. Amara was no longer a shadow ruler. She was the explicit one. She moved out of her small cabin and into one of the main house's guest rooms, the one Elias had been using. He was moved back into the master bedroom, the room where his wife had died, a prisoner in a gilded cage. Amara took over Thomas's upbringing completely. She taught him to read and write, but she also taught him her own curriculum. He learned the names of the plants in her garden, the stories of the African ancestors, the philosophy of the scales and the debt. She was raising him not to be a plantation master, but to be her successor. She was forging her knowledge, her spirit, into the heart of the Thorne bloodline. She was not just ending a dynasty. She was co-opting it, transforming it from the inside out. Elias could only watch. His days were empty, meaningless. He was a king in name only, a living ghost. He had everything a man of his station was supposed to want: land, wealth, a healthy heir, and yet he had nothing. He had lost the one thing that truly mattered, his will. Amara had not killed him. She had done something far worse. She had left him alive to witness her victory. Years passed. The world outside Vaudreuil was changing. The whispers of abolition grew louder. The tensions between North and South strained towards a breaking point. But within the borders of the plantation, time seemed to stand still. Vaudreuil was an island, a self-contained kingdom ruled by a quiet, unyielding queen. Thomas grew from a boy into a young man. He was tall and strong, with his father's features, but Amara's eyes, dark, still, and filled with an ancient knowing. He treated the people of the plantation not as property, but as family. He worked alongside them in the fields, listened to their stories, and learned their ways. He called Elias father, but he called Amara mother. Elias grew old. The bourbon had etched deep lines into his face. His hair had turned a ghostly white. He was a frail, stooped figure, often seen sitting on the veranda, staring out at the cane fields with vacant eyes. He rarely spoke. There was nothing left to say. One day, a visitor arrived at Vaudreuil. He was a young man from the north, a journalist, he said, writing a series of articles on the economics of the southern plantation system. He had heard that Vaudreuil was one of the most productive and efficiently run sugar plantations in Louisiana, and he wanted to interview its master. Elias agreed, a flicker of his old self stirring within him. He sat with the journalist in his dusty study, trying to articulate the principles of his success. But the words felt hollow, like a language he had forgotten. The journalist, sensing his reticence, turned his questions to the people of the plantation. "They seem remarkably content for slaves," the young man observed. "There's a spirit of cooperation here I haven't seen elsewhere." Elias just nodded. The journalist pressed on. "I've heard rumors of a woman here, a healer. They say she holds a great deal of influence." Before Elias could answer, the study door opened. Amara entered, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of cool water. She was older now, her hair streaked with silver, but her posture was as straight and proud as ever. She placed the tray on the table and looked at the journalist. Her gaze was not hostile, but it was deeply unsettling, as if she were weighing his soul on her scales. The journalist, a man of words and confidence, suddenly found himself unable to speak. Amara then looked at Elias. "Thomas needs you," she said softly. "He is having trouble with the new irrigation pump." Elias stood up without a word, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled, and shuffled out of the room. The journalist was left alone with Amara. He never wrote about Vaudreuil. His notes from that day contained only one cryptic sentence: "The master is not the one who holds the deed, but the one who holds the debt. If you've stayed with me to this point, you're part of the inner circle. You understand that this isn't just a story about revenge. It's about the transfer of power, and all transfers of power require a final, symbolic act. That act came in the spring of 1860. Elias Thorne was dying. His body, ravaged by years of alcohol and despair, was finally giving out. He lay in the master bedroom, the same room where he had brought his bride, the room where she had died. He was lucid, his mind clear for the first time in years. As he lay there, watching the sunlight filter through the Spanish moss outside his window, he felt a strange sense of peace. The struggle was over. Amara sat in a chair by his bedside. She was not there as a healer, but as a witness. Thomas, now a man of 20, stood at the foot of the bed. "It's yours now," Elias rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "All of it." Thomas looked not at his father, but at Amara. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I will take care of it, father," Thomas said. Elias turned his head to look at Amara. "You won, you know," he said. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet acknowledgement of fact. "There was never a war," Amara replied, her voice as calm as the bayou at dawn. "There was only a correction, a balancing. The world is as it should be." She stood and came to the bedside, placing her cool hand on his forehead, the same way she had done for his wife so many years ago. "The debt is paid, Elias Thorne. You may rest now." He closed his eyes. He thought of the young, arrogant man he had been, standing in the slave market in New Orleans. He thought of the woman on the block, the bargain he thought he had found. A bargain. Yes, a bargain had been struck that day. He had offered a small price for a woman's skill, and she had accepted. But the price he paid was not the one he had offered. The price was everything. His wife, his children, his name, his soul. With that final thought, he let go, and the silence in the room became absolute. The death of Elias Thorne was noted in the parish records as the end of an era. The Thorne dynasty, once so powerful, had come to an end. The plantation Vaudreuil passed to his only son, Thomas. What the world didn't know was that the name on the deed was irrelevant. Thomas Thorne, raised by Amara, did not see himself as a master. He saw himself as a custodian. The first document he signed as the new owner of Vaudreuil was a writ of manumission. It granted freedom to every man, woman, and child on the plantation. Legally, he could not do this for all of them at once without raising suspicion and facing legal challenges from his white neighbors. So he did it strategically, freeing families one by one, listing the reason as for meritorious service. He used the profits from the sugar cane to buy their loyalty and their silence. In the eyes of the law, Vaudreuil remained a plantation, but in reality it had become something else. A free colony, a sanctuary, a sovereign nation in the heart of the slaveholding South, hidden in plain sight. Amara, now a free woman, remained as its spiritual and practical leader. She continued to teach, to heal, and to expand her network, preparing for the great upheaval she knew was coming. The Civil War was on the horizon, a national-scale balancing of the scales. When it came, Vaudreuil would be ready. The story of what happened next, of how this small, hidden community navigated the chaos of war and reconstruction, is a tale for another time. But the foundation had been laid. It had been laid with herbs and roots, with whispers and chants, with stolen knowledge and reclaimed power. And it had all started with a single fateful purchase. A plantation owner bought a midwife to ensure his family's future. And she did, just not the one he had in mind. She ensured the future of a different family, a different people, a different idea of what it means to be free. This case was never just about one family. It was a glimpse into the hidden machinery of power. It reveals that the most resilient systems of control are not built on whips and chains, but on knowledge, psychology, and the slow, patient manipulation of human hope and fear. Amara's story is a chilling testament to the idea that true power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in a sick room. It hums a lullaby to another woman's child. It brews in a pot of tea. The horror of Vaudreuil is not in the supernatural, but in the terrifyingly natural. It's the horror of a brilliant, broken mind using its gifts not for good or for evil, but for a form of cosmic justice that is utterly indifferent to human sentiment. She became a force of nature, like a flood or a fire, clearing the ground for new growth, and Elias Thorne was just a tree standing in the way. But was everything truly revealed? We have the story as Elias saw it, the narrative of a man descending into madness and paranoia. Could the stillbirths have been natural tragedies? Could the deaths of Beau and the overseer's dogs have been coincidences? Was Amara a master manipulator, a quiet murderer, or was she simply a mirror onto which a guilty man projected his own deepest fears? Perhaps the most terrifying possibility is that both are true, that she was a healer who, when confronted with injustice, simply chose to let nature take its course, withholding the cure that could have changed the outcome. Is inaction a form of murder? The story of Vaudreuil remains hidden in the shadows of history, a question mark hanging over the humid Louisiana air. What do you think really happened on that plantation? Was Amara a righteous avenger or a cold-blooded monster? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want to explore more of history's darkest secrets, subscribe to The Sealed Room and ring the bell for notifications. You're not just a viewer. You're now part of this story's unwritten chapter, Because sometimes, history's most terrifying secrets are not buried in forgotten graves. They are planted, nurtured, and passed down, waiting for the right time to bloom.